Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of OpsCast, where I host guests from across the MLOps and DevOps communities, sharing a snapshot into their current challenges and how they're being tackled. I'm your host, Tom Parker, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Andy McMahon. Andy has a very long list of accolades. I won't mention absolutely everything, but I will give you a bit of an overview because it's very impressive. He is the author of the highly rated ML Engineering with Python. Definitely check that out. 2022's British Data Awards Rising Star of the Year, guest lecturer, and all-round AI and ML expert. I am delighted to be joined by Andy. Andy, a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much for spending the time. Would you be able to give our viewers and listeners just a bit of an idea as to you and your background?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Tom. Delighted to be here. So as you said, I've done a lot of different things, but I think the key thread for me was a few years ago, did a PhD in physics, realized didn't want to be an academic. So had a look around, what could I do? This was the time of the Harvard Business Review, Data Scientist of the Year stuff. Sexiest job of the 21st century, data scientist. And yeah, just from that, fell into the whole world of building products with data, eventually became more of an ML engineer than a data scientist.
Yeah.
And I really haven't looked back since. So the big push for me has always been, how do you generate value from data? And it's by building products and services. It's not just good ideas that live in sort of proof of concept plans. So yeah, I've done that through various roles in various industries, and then that's sort of taken me to the point I am now that you sort of described there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a really nice background, as you say, coming from academia, moving into that commercial world. And I think from the questions that will run through, that balance of experiences that you've had should provide some really nice insight to the guys out there listening. Fantastic. We will jump into our questions. As usual with OpsCast, we tend to stick to a similar line of questioning, just so we can kind of balance out, guess what are the views over a certain period of time, and what's the crossover there, or any differences in the answers that are being given. So I'll start with question 1 as usual. What's the most interesting challenge that you're currently facing?
Yeah, the big one for me right now is, I spent a long time the past few years thinking deeply about MLOps and MLOps at scale for large enterprises, big organizations, etc. And now what I'm thinking a lot about is, how do we adapt what we've already built, what we've already learned for this new world of generative AI? So there's all these terms like LLM ops, I've seen GenAI ops, I've seen everything else. And what I'm trying to discern just now through a variety of different sort of mechanisms and projects and thinking is, how much of this is really different? How much is just applying what we've learned in a slightly different setting? How much is, some absolutely new thing that we're going to have to build from scratch? And I think there's a lot of really interesting questions that come out of that. How do you monitor and evaluate these models? How do you really build a end-to-end development lifecycle where in classic machine learning, you built and owned the model yourself. Now you often don't. There's just all these kind of nice challenges I'm seeing. So I'd say that's the most interesting one I'm currently facing. And it's also the one that is most pressing, given all the hype and the investment and the really big push to leverage this new technology. I think we really need to start answering that question about not just how do we build lots of nice demos, but how do we build those robust products and services and go into production consistently and industrialize all of this. So I think that's the thing that's occupying my headspace most just now, really.
Absolutely. And on the two sides of that, and there's obviously a lot more to be done in that space, are you seeing that there still needs to be a lot of transition and change from maybe traditional methods moving into the more complex, as you say, kind of LLM space, etc.?
I think the big lesson I've learned already, and I wonder how long this will stand, but the big lesson I've learned already is that most things are additive. So I view generative AI as very additive to your existing processes and stack and best practice. So I think that kind of core of good ML ops, and even beneath that, good DevOps, I think that's still absolutely there. So you still need all of the things we've learned about automation, about testing, about monitoring, about evaluation, about deployment, about infrastructure. I think all of that stands. I just think there's very specific elements where there's a new flavor has to be added. So, for example, on the deployment side, in classic sort of ML ops, you're very much thinking about how do I take this model that I've built or my data scientists have built and wrap it in a nice pipeline, make it quite robust, deploy it in some infrastructure, scale it, balance the load, etc. Now you're thinking more, how do I interface with an external API that I don't really own? Or maybe I do own because I've fine-tuned my own model and deployed it internally, but it's just a slightly different pattern of consumption where rather than me really owning end-to-ends, the provenance of that model, I now have to trust that it's being served somewhere else. You know, what happens if there's downtime? What's my fallbacks? Things like that. And then on the infrastructure side, you know, on the one hand, you'd think that not owning the model means you need less infrastructure because it's pre-trained. On the other hand, we're finding that actually demand for GPUs is far outstripping supply, and that's because everyone wants to take these models and fine-tune and play with them and build their own sort of versions of them. So there's kind of these interesting specific challenges that are popping up, but the main things that they're definitely carrying over are, again, those need for solid software development practices. It's not going anywhere. I think monitoring and evaluation is huge, and in fact, there's really open questions there, but the real need for it is there. So if you're going to deploy these things in production, how are you going to track that they're actually performing as expected? They're not going off the rails. The new challenge there is, you know, I'm not just sort of saying, here's a metric. Is it within the bounds of those that metric? It's now something a bit more fluid. It's am I within guardrails? Am I moderating the content appropriately and things like that? So there's, I think there's a lot that carries over and it's very additive. So I think we are realizing that as a community. But there is still a lot to solve. But I think that makes it really exciting. So it's a good space to be in, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting piece that I think DevOps, even though it's older as a concept and is more established in production environments than the move to say ML, MLOps with all that's happening, is still not there. You talked about monitoring there, and that is still additive in DevOps. That's really only become a bigger thing maybe over the last 2.5 years or so. So all of this is a very quick, or needs to be a very quick learning curve in a highly complex space. That's a really interesting point in how that transition and actually what you use from traditional DevOps, MLOps that will still be relevant and actually will not be as well.
Yeah, and I think you've picked on something interesting there, that a lot of organizations will want to leverage the latest and greatest tools, GenAI, etc., but they'll kind of realize the reality of what they have is down here. So there's a gap there that they want to close very, very quickly. So it'll be interesting to see how organizations that maybe haven't sort of matured even their core DevOps journeys, like you mentioned, actually can speed that up because they'll have to. I don't think there's a shortcut, really. I think you need to build that really good sort of core set of muscles in the organization about getting things built well, scaling it, putting it in production, and repeating and rinsing that cycle.
Yeah. And
I just think that doing that in this fast evolving, research intensive, crazy new AI world is going to be difficult in itself. But if you've not got the core sort of principles and practices in place, it'll be even more difficult. So I think that'll be a big challenge for people as our teams, is when they realize that actually where they are and where they want to be, there's a bit of a delta there that they need to cover quite quickly if they want to realize the value and return from their investments that they're making.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've done similar chats too, and I can't mention who it is, and the article will be live over the coming weeks. And as I was chatting to you earlier offline, but a big pharma group who are going through very similar challenges and actually getting both sides established to get to their business case. A lot of that was communication, actually understanding what is the need for this and then working back from there. So yeah, a lot of crossover and similarities. That's really useful. Thank you. And you kind of covered question 2 slightly there in what you've taken away from that, but what would you highlight out of those learnings that you could share with the community?
Yeah, I think one I maybe didn't mention that I think will be important is I don't really see classic ML, if I call it that, or traditional ML, whatever, however we differentiate it from GenAI, non-GenAI, I don't see that going anywhere for a long time. And I think what we might see is, actually that the time to proof of concept's a bit faster because LLMs and GenAI can speed that up. It's far easier to say just you ask ChatGPT or some variant of an LLM to help you write some code and spin up a dashboard, and all these things happen a bit faster. But ultimately, when it comes to solving a business problem, maybe in a regulated industry, or maybe you just want that level of control, there's something about having a much simpler, fully understandable model in place that you can control the inputs and outputs much more. Monitoring's much clearer, testing and validation's a bit more of a known science. So I think that sort of will mean that we'll see a lot of workloads and systems where generative AI and classic ML live together side by side.
Yeah.
You might see sort of things emerging where maybe the LLMs are used more to actually formulate more complex pieces of work and tasks that are then executed by simpler sort of submodules that reference traditional ML models. So I think that's a bit more of a kind of a speculative one, but it's definitely one I'm seeing where I just see so many use cases now where it's, it's still your light GBMs, it's still your XGBoosts, it's still your linear regressions, it's still the classic stuff. And that I think is just a testament to the fact that the sort of the minimum viable product is still an important concept. You shouldn't just go to generative AI because it's hot.
Yeah.
You need to identify the use cases where it actually makes sense and has real value add. So really complex natural language cases or cases where, you're actually doing something a bit more in an agent sort of setting. You have to break down really complex tasks or summarize really complex documents, things like that. So I think that's a big learning as well that people are going through. It's like, where does this actually make sense? Because if I just use this mallet to crack every nut that I see and sort of see everything or a hammer and I see everything as a nail, I'm going to get into trouble. So there's a fine balance there. I think that's been a few kind of things that I've seen as well on top of what I said earlier.
That's really useful. And this is a really general question on the back of that, but are you seeing teams who are adopting or attempting to adopt the top end technology where actually they don't have the use cases for this and the kind of jumping on the bandwagon type follow on?
I think if I said I wasn't, I'd be completely lying. And I think that it's not just sort of teams, it's the whole world almost, because the real thing that sort of something like ChatGPT I think brought out wasn't just that, it was a really powerful large language model, it could do new stuff. It could and it couldn't. It was it wasn't completely left field given where the field was at, but it was very much the purview before of experts in that area who were super keen. What ChatGPT did was bring it to the masses. And you had all these people who'd never heard of AI or like they just thought about it in terms of Terminator or something. Now they could actually interact with it and understand, no, this is software, this is something I could use in my daily life.
Yeah.
And that just naturally means you now have a lower barrier to entry. So you have a lot of people who are maybe not from the super technical domains who get exposed to this and they think, well, I can apply this here and there. And I think that's excellent. That's a very positive thing. But it does naturally mean that people will see everything through that lens. So the tendency will be there to say, oh, I could get a large language model to do that. I could get a large language model to do that. And it's about meeting in the middle where that will create a lot of really high demand, but there will be within that lots of good signal among the noise. The key point is to get your technical experts and the people who understand the technology, working with those partners, educating them, and really meeting in the middle. Because there are going to be great use cases that technologists don't think of. And I think that's super important. Like it's never the technologists definitely don't have all the answers. We absolutely do not. We need to work in partnership with subject matter experts or business colleagues or stakeholders. And that's super important. So I think, there's definitely a lot of cases flying around where you go, that sort of doesn't make sense. I heard a story recently about, someone in an engineering company presented to the board. It's like they build hydraulics and stuff, and someone on the board said, "Can we put AI in the hydraulics?" And he's like, "No, it's like a piston. It's just what it does. It's no AI. It doesn't make sense."
Yeah.
But you'll see kind of stories like that appearing. But the key is just to build build communication channels and sort of educate each other so that we meet in the middle somewhere. But yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of fun cases where you think, well, that's more just a regex or a SQL query. That's not. I don't need a literal supercomputer to come up with the answer for that.
Yeah, no, it comes back to what was about the use case and knowing what you need this for. I mean, it's going to get 2 calls a week or 1 million in a minute.
Exactly.
Then you build different products and services, right? It's just coming back to that endpoint first. Exactly. Awesome. I was really interested to ask you this third question, because I think your background from academia as an author, commercially as well, there'll be a lot of different things you can draw upon, and it may be hard to find one piece of advice, but the question is one piece of advice that you would share with other MLOps teams that might provide some value for them.
Yeah, I think something I always think about, and I think this applies to any team, is really think about the full end-to-end process for what you're trying to do, and just remember that you don't exist in a vacuum. I think it's so easy for teams to just naturally become insular, especially technology teams, right? We love our technology, we love what we're doing, we built this cool thing, and we just you can just very easily sort of become an echo chamber. What's important is really reaching out into the wider context and seeing how does that actually generate value. So, speak to your business partners. If you're in, like, I've worked more recently in larger organizations where an MLOps team or a data team will sort of be its own thing, and then the business units will be somewhere else. It's so important to bridge that gap and really understand the business, understand the problem area. Don't just kind of think, I've built this cool thing, therefore it will be used. That's not how it works. So I think really view yourself as part of that wider ecosystem. And I think that's even true if you're in a smaller company, you're building something. How do you have basically market fit? How do you understand that you're going to actually generate the value there? When I worked in a much smaller company, like a sort of startup, that was always at the front of our mind was, we're building all this cool technology, but is it actually solving the real problem? So I think that's super important, and especially in something hot like MLOps, where there's just all this excitement about platforms and tools, and there's an announcement every week about something that's just came out and another thing to play with. I think it's just important to go back to those basics and think, why are we actually doing this? We're doing this because machine learning, data science is proven to generate huge amounts of value, but it only does it if it's deployed reliably, robustly, and scalably. How do I know what I should deploy? I work with subject matter experts. And just that kind of logical, thinking through it, making it simple, often means that you will do the thing that generates most value and ultimately be more successful. I think I'm always very skeptical of just playing with the latest tools for the sake of it. It's just so important to go after that value, and you do that by reaching out into that wider context, as I said.
Absolutely. And side question from that, you talked about reaching out to wider teams internally there, and obviously you've got the communities outside of your team as well. My background coming from DevOps into MLOps is a one where it's very community driven. There's a lot of open source tech and tooling. Where does that fit in what you're seeing in the MLOps community and being able to discuss the new tooling, what's working, what's not working, what's worth it, what isn't?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think open source is just always such a core part of all of software. So I think it's important to always see what's happening in those spaces, and the big open source projects that are backed by big foundations and players, etc. Those are important because they form the sort of linchpins, the cornerstones of everything that happens. I do think it is extremely competitive, and it's hard to sort of really sort of sometimes discern between different vendors. I think in the space, it's really hard. There's lots of people for a few years claiming that they do end-to-end MLOps, and that just sort of muddies the waters a bit. So I think it's a fun question to navigate. I don't know that I necessarily know the answer. Just what I've seen is that it is a very collaborative community, like the wider data community is. There's lots of great stuff out there. People do share their best practices, share knowledge. There's lots of great stuff online, open source, etc. But I do see kind of, there is a lot of very tight competition when it comes to the platforms and the tooling. And sometimes it's an interesting challenge to, try and get different vendors who are offering slightly different things to just see that and see how they could complement each other rather than a winner takes all mentality. I think that's always an interesting one to navigate. And then you've got the kind of, this is maybe a side note, but an interesting one is, the public cloud offerings and just how competitive all of that tooling is. And I think it's very easy for people, if you're newer to the field, you can sometimes get caught up in all this and think, what's the right tool? Where do I start? And I just always say, park that to the side. It's always about principles, processes, really those fundamentals. And then whether you go on public cloud A or public cloud B, platform A, platform B, as long as it's within your cost profile, then you'll be able to do something correctly and something well. But yeah, it's a very good community. And I think initiatives like this podcast, and there's lots of other great stuff out there there is a lot of good stuff and good community. And I think it's important to reach out to those people. If you see people you're interested in, just ping them a message, and they're often extremely friendly. But yeah, but it's a fun community to be part of. But there's a few different things to navigate within it, I think.
Nice. Fantastic, thank you. It's a slightly negative sounding question, this, but it is a really useful one for the community. Is there a project you look at in the past that you would view as a failure, and probably more importantly, what lessons would you take away from that if there was?
That is a toughie. I find it very hard to view things as failures, because not because you didn't reach the objective you wanted to, but I always try and view things as a learning experience. I know it's a bit cliche. I always think, if we tried to do something and it was really hard, and we knew we do know what we're doing, then it probably just means it's a really innovative thing. So it's probably it's a good space to be in. If it was easy, then I'd be a bit more worried, sort of thing. But to your specific point, I've definitely worked on a couple of projects where the challenge of getting into production was extremely tough, especially in like financial services where I work now. So a few years I was head of MLOps at NatWest Group and sort of did work there. And I remember some of my early projects there, just it's just the nature of where you are and sort of the specific domain area and all the specific tech we were trying to stick together. But I think that's always been a big learning is, how hard is it actually to get to production? And how hard is it to communicate the benefits of going to production more widely? Because some teams and organizations are like, we don't really need that. We'll just run things in dev on a notebook and export the answers. And, there's just, I think, so it's not viewing them as a failure, but I think I've definitely learned the most about the benefits of automation, the benefits of clear communication, cross-functional teams, clear routes to live, good processes from the pain of going through production in a very kind of roundabout or not straightforward way. So I think not necessarily a failure, but really good learnings, basically.
Yeah, those tougher challenges that do teach you things and you can take things away from.
No, exactly. The first project I did at NatWest, I won't give away too many details because I can't talk about it really, but kind of really innovative project, stitching together different technologies. We had Graph, we had Spark, we had lots of different things flying around. First time it was really done. Huge data sets, we had to batch process, transforming them in all sorts of different ways. And it was so complex to get that all together and push through. But I learned so much from it, and so did the team. Because once we went through that, we were like, right, we can just apply these learnings everywhere else, and just everything else became a lot smoother because you were automatically like, don't do it that way. We did it that way. It was terrible. Do it this way. And I think those, to your point, those ones are where you learn the most. So I would say, if you're going through something like that and you're listening, embrace it because it will stand you in good stead in the future.
Absolutely. No, that's really useful. Thank you so much. And our final question, feel free to be as diplomatic or undiplomatic on this. It's just a little bit of fun, really. Your most loved and your most loathed tech.
Right. All tech. This is all tech.
Anything you want.
Right. Okay. I absolutely love my MacBook. So my wife for my 30th birthday got me a MacBook M2 at the time, and it's a beautiful machine. It's my favorite laptop ever. It just works. It's so smooth. I just love everything about it. Keyboard, all of it, the graphics, so good. I need to update the RAM actually. It's not got much RAM on it, but it's just so good for everything I do. And it's like the smoothest experience I've ever had. Tech that I hate. I for some reason have this like curse where I can never get a printer at home to work. So I hate all printers. And it's such a specific, weird, random thing, right? But I just absolutely detest printers. They just never work for me.
Last guest on OpsCast said exactly the same thing.
You're joking. You're joking.
No,
I've not listened to it yet. Oh my God. That's amazing.
Actually, about the printer cartridges and how painful it was when
yes,
you have to buy a new half-filled printer cartridges.
Oh man, maybe there's a trend among ops.
So there we go. We found it. Yeah, if nothing else on OpsCast, we found the trend in printer issues.
But yeah, I think so. There's not much about MLOps in there, or
Yeah.
there's lots of ML tech that I love, and not too much that I loathe, but definitely tons I love. But yeah, my MacBook I absolutely love. Just all home printers, absolutely hate with a passion.
Yeah. Is there anything ML tech wise at the moment that you're seeing out there that you're particularly excited about or would like to try that maybe you haven't had the chance to?
I think so. I spoke a lot about in my book, the latest edition, a lot of really good tools that came out that were sort of, open source. So I really love tools like that just, really make it clear to the user how important a pipeline is. Because I think that's one of the fundamental concepts of MLOps, really. I talk about that a lot in my book is that's how you move from, scrappy notebook, experimental lab book type workflow to the sort of atomic unit of a system that I can orchestrate, I can test, I can scale, I can host. And I just love tools that kind of make that clear. And there's a lot of really good, it's getting really sort of low level. There's a lot of good mechanisms now where they provide just functionality where you can just add some decorators to your Python functions, and that automatically makes it into a DAG for you that becomes a pipeline. I just think all of those tools are really good for helping people transition to that world of building good ML pipelines. So yeah, really like all of that stuff. It's super geeky specific thing, but I just think it's really positive. Yeah, it's good.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you so much. There's a huge amount there in a very short amount of time, so I really appreciate you running through that. And as I said, I think with your experiences, you provide a different kind of insight and viewpoint to other people that we've spoken to, so that's fantastic. Go check out Andy's publication, work that he's doing. There's a huge amount there on social as well. We'll put some links in the chat below when we post this out. You can check us out on YouTube, on Spotify, through the UR site. Any questions, ping them below and we'll pick up for you. But Andy, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And we'll see everyone on episode 4.
Thanks for having me.